Hi, good evening. Here we are again, Michael, Cam, and Anurag. And we are going to be discussing now the meat of the matter, meat of the subject on relevance realization. We'll be covering episodes 29 and episode 30 of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis by John Vervaeke. So, in a certain way, we took a break a few weeks before we got to this session. And I felt that we almost needed that to jump in.
I agree. This is pretty meaty. This last three episodes, really.
Indeed, indeed,
Right.
indeed. So good. So who wants to kick off with any preamble, any topic, any thread you want to, any observation? How about you, Cam? Yeah, anything?
I would love to. I'll try to be brief. So I wanted to throw out a couple ideas for form. So I've been reflecting a lot on the work that we've been doing, and I don't remember exactly what I did, but at one point I started to introduce a little bit of a ritual. So I'm going to try again with that right now, and I want to. The first move is an expression of appreciation. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to practice with you gentlemen. It feels like an enormous privilege, and it's a joy. So I deeply appreciate that. And then the second move is a gesture of humility. I want to, humbly bow my head in honor to all of the work that has been done before by those that have gone before us. It's very humbling to be in its presence. So those are the first two moves. And then in terms of form, so these two episodes in particular, I've done this before, but I did it several times personally and going through them this time, where he covers so much ground, and we allot ourselves 60 minutes to go through two episodes out of whack here, and it's a preposterous attempt. But that said, what he does reliably is at the beginning of each episode, he does a quick recap of the preceding episode. So the proposition here would be that we simply read that out, like one of us with the transcript, and just simply read the. I would actually open with that. So we've kind of been trying to go sequentially. So I would actually go to, in this instance, it's 30, right? We did 29 and 30.
29 and 30.
So I would read that little intro out of the transcript out of 30, because that basically recaps the first one. And then it also sets up the key point. It sets up where he's going to go in 30. And then what I would do is introduce some of the circling practice stuff. So like we did with Guy out in San Rafael, Michael. So I've been paying closer attention to how they're operating. And there's this kind of a basic routine of you do one lap through all of the participants as to what is most salient, what seems most salient to that particular participant. And then we all get to hear each other's first pass at that, what seems most salient. And we do a second one quickly through. And maybe at that point, you start to winnow it down as to, okay, of what was presented, is there any consensus yet? And then I think I would defer to you, Anurag, to choose it, to simply be the, since you're doing the service of facilitating these, to say this is where we're going to focus, and then pick that apart. And then by that time, we're probably halfway or more through, and I would allot time at the end. I would allot at least like maybe as much as the last 10 minutes to basically read a little bit out of the end of the transcript of 30, where he recaps that one and sets up what's to come, and then leave like the last few minutes for closing remarks from each of us. So I think that even that routine is pretty ambitious, but those were my thoughts on form.
I like with your idea a lot. I think it might be quite supportive of what we're trying to do, because it is difficult. You're right, it's preposterous what we're trying to do.
Needless to say, I think there's no debate. It's really good contribution and start. Thank you for putting additional format and structure, and especially starting with, gratitude and humility. I love that. And my version of what you said would be the Indian tradition of saying namaste. Namaste literally means I bow to the good in you. Right.
Yeah.
So that's to me, that's always been the way of encountering someone. And that's why it's both a greeting of meeting as well as bidding of goodbye, where you start by bowing to the best or the good part of the person you're encountering and leaving them with that sense as well. Anyway, that's my way of contributing. Michael, anything you want to open up with? And we will do exactly what Cam said after that.
Well, I'm going to start, I mean, with what his structure is. I think it's great. Well, one huge piece of gratitude that I realized during the retreat weekend for Evolve Move Play that Cam and I were at is that one of my goals in engaging with those workshops was to hopefully connect with people that I would stay connected with. And when I was there, Cam came and Vish came, and I realized that, we've all been in connection for a year. And I'm like, I'm so grateful that's working. I'm like, because it's been tough. I've not had luck with this for years. And I'm like, cool. So I'm really, really grateful. And it's speaking of humility, like I'm looking at the material that we're studying and realizing how ambitious it really is even to tackle this subject, no matter who you are. I mean, if you're Vervaeke, I don't care who you are. This is a very big subject to tackle. And, I'm humbled by the prospect that maybe we're actually going to get some useful material out of it that we can use, because there's a big difference between the intellectual understanding and the application. So yeah, I'm humbled by that. And yet we soldier on, right? So despite that reality.
Yeah.
So Cam, as chance would have it, I downloaded the entire script of all his episodes, and I
Nice.
have the script in front of me, literally verbatim, because I downloaded it from the site. So I can, if you want, read off one paragraph. Unless you have it in front of you, you can also read it off, the opening paragraphs or two where he sums it up.
So that'd be
Either way, I have it open as well.
Okay, why don't you start us off? My suggestion would be, because we are entering the territory of relevance realization, if you could read the summary of 29
Okay.
and 30 both, that will both tell us how we enter that episode, as well as what the look back is. And then we will discuss, as planned, the 29.
Yeah, the salient points, right?
Yep. Okay, so here we go. 20.
The opening of 29 and the opening of 30. And then we will discuss 29.
So 29, opening here. He says, this is episode 29. So last time I went through with you a series of arguments trying to show you the centrality of the issue of relevance realization. I want to review that with you and then try to begin an account of how we might come up with a naturalistic explanation of relevance realization, and then build that into an overall plausibility argument about using that notion of relevance realization to explain many of the features that we consider central to human spirituality, meaning-making, self-transcendence, altered states of consciousness, and wisdom. Before I begin that, I want to remind everybody of how much the work I'm talking about now has been done in collaboration with other people. I'm not going to read through the attributions here. Some current work with Leo Ferraro, Anderson Todd, Richard Wu. Current work I'm doing with Christopher, still more of the attribution. So we want to take a look at what we did last time. We did, very quickly to remind you, a series of arguments that pointed towards how central relevance realization is. We did arguments around the nature of problem solving. And you remember, we saw the idea there of the search space as proposed by Newell and Simon. And we faced a couple of important issues there. We faced issues of combinatorial explosion, and what we need is problem formulation or problem framing that allows us to avoid combinatorial explosion by zeroing in on relevant information. I also proposed to you, and I'll return to this later, that problem solving is our best way of trying to understand what we mean by intelligence. Your capacity as being a general problem solver. Also, we know the problem of ill-definedness. Very often, a problem formulation is needed in order to determine what the relevant information is and what the relevant structure of that information is. So that again points us to relevance. These two together, combinatorial explosion and ill-definedness, also pointed towards a phenomenon we've already talked about, insight. And the fact that you often have to solve a problem by altering your problem formulation and redetermining what you consider relevant. We then took a look at categorization. I'll come back to this again in another way a little bit later in this lecture, but we took a look at how categorization ultimately depends on judgments of similarity and can get into an equivocation then. We can equivocate between a purely logical notion of similarity, in which case any two objects are indefinitely similar or dissimilar to each other. And if we mean instead of logical similarity, which would not help us to categorize psychological similarity, okay, then we're talking about making a comparison of two things in terms of the relevant features of comparison, the relevant aspects. So we're into relevance, and we're also introducing an important idea that I want you to remember, this notion of an aspect. That's capital A aspect there. A set of relevant features that cohere together and are relevant to us, especially in projects like categorization. So we keep getting relevance. Let's see, of course, if you remember, doing good cognitive science, I do a convergence argument, draws convergence diagram again, to get a trustworthy problem or construct. And then I basically do a divergence argument, draws equally balancing diverging lines to the right to show it how it has the potential to explain many important phenomena and establish a relevant balance between them. And so that's what I'm building here, indicates the balanced construct drawn on the board. Right now, we're on this side, left converging, how all these things are converging on relevance realization. And then, as I said, we can use this to explain many of the features that seem to be central to human spirituality, meaning making, self-transcendence, altered states of consciousness, and wisdom. So this goes on. There's 3 more paragraphs. You want me to keep going on, or should I stop there?
Your call.
I think that's more than enough to set 29 up.
Oh, go ahead.
So did you want me to go ahead and do that same thing with the next episode, or do you want to do rounds on what we think is most salient or most helpful for us to work on out of
So this was just a recap of what we covered last time, if I recall correctly.
So wait a minute. So this was the summary that was at the beginning of 29 or the beginning of 30?
Therefore, summary of 28.
Oh, I see. Okay. So that's setting us up for 29. So maybe we should read the summary of 29 now.
That would be the opening of 30 and
30.
then discuss then discuss 29.
Exactly. I think that makes sense. Yeah.
I'll do that. So hold on. Okay, this is episode 30. Let me get the page set here. So last time we decided to dig into the central issue of realizing what's relevant. And we are following a methodological principle of not using or presupposing relevance. The capacity to realize relevance in any process, purported cognitive process or brain process that we're going to use to try and explain that ability. I gave you a series of arguments that we can't use representations to explain relevance because representations crucially presuppose it. And then we took a look at some very interesting empirical evidence that really comports very well with that. The evidence supporting finsting and your ability to do enactive demonstrative reference. This salience tagging, just making stand out the here-ness and now-ness of something. And we then took a look at, and we drew a few conclusions about the meaning, about in meaning in life, that connectedness. That connectedness is ultimately not generated by representations. Again, I'm going to keep saying this. I'm not denying that representations and belief in that level can alter and transform what we find relevant. We are talking about the explanation of the phenomenon, not how it is causally affected by other aspects of cognition. We then took a look at a syntactic level, the computational level, and saw arguments that neither inference nor rules can be used to explain the generation of relevance precisely because they also presuppose it. We looked at trying to deal with relevance in terms of some sort of internal module dedicated to it, and that won't work. It's homuncular. And relevance realization needs to be scale-invariant, or at least multi-scalular. It has to be happening simultaneously in a local and global way that points towards something else we noted about any theory that has to account for this self-organization of relevance that is demonstrated in the phenomena of insight. So we then saw that a theory has to use explanatory ideas that point to processes that are, at least in the original sense, internal to the relevance realization, the relevance system. I tried to get clear about how not to misunderstand them. What I meant was the goals of that govern relevance realization initially have to be constitutive goals. They cannot be goals built upon representing the environment in a particular way. Instead, they have to be the constitutive goals that are part of an autopoietic system, a system that is self-organized because it has the goal of preserving and protecting and promoting its own self-organization. That draws deep connections between relevance realization and life, and relevance realization and being an autopoietic thing. And of course, as I've already mentioned, relevance realization processes have to be multi-scalular. They have to be self-organizing, and they have to be capable of developmental self-transcendence, self-correction, insight, etc. We noted along the way about how this links up with an argument about how the propositional depends on the procedural, which then depends on the perspectival, which then depends on, is grounded in the participatory.
That's it. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah.
That's a lot, both in terms of entering and exiting from that chapter, from that episode. So,
Yeah.
Michael, you want to go? We'll do the circle. We'll go around.
Okay, so yeah, it is a lot. But I mean, one of the things that I saw that he did in 28 and 29 to some degree was to argue against certain views. So that's part of what he did. Like, you know, he's saying that computational, you know, can't explain everything. And what else did he say? Well, he also introduced other concepts that help, like the multiple object tracking concept, which was very interesting because, you know, if you were tracking a certain number of objects, you're not going to notice the details of them, just the position, which I thought was, and there's the gorilla. And did he mention the gorilla suit? Yeah. So that, you know, I've heard that before, and I thought that was really great. Let's see here. And let's see, yes, this is definitely a lot. This it's funny because 28 seemed like a setup for 30, and I found 30 a lot more relatable. Partly because I had to look up so many terms for these last 3 episodes that it took quite a bit of time doing that. It was a little harder to kind of put it all together. But anyway, yeah, it's one of the things that I'm interested in is that what I've been studying, polyvagal theory, is pretty much exactly what he's coming to in 30. Now he's framing it a little bit differently, but I'm really excited to see how he frames all, you know, as we go through how he frames it. And one of the things that I'm not sure about yet is if he's actually indicating that a lot of this is a subconscious process, because that's what I'm learned, is it's largely that. So that's actually what I'm really interested in, is how much of it can be driven by our orientation here and how much has to be driven by other aspects that can't necessarily be cognitively driven. That's my big question mark, because that's what I do every day in my office, is trying to figure that out for individuals. I think that's all I have to put there right now. Why don't you go ahead, Anurag, and add what you have to offer there.
So, by the way, Cam, the setup of the summation that you just walked us through was really helpful, because I think in episode 29, which we're discussing, he is actually saying why the conventional theories of relevance are not going to work in explaining relevance realization. And he takes down each of the theory. And I think his takedown is very interesting and is worth understanding before we get to what he defines at the end of this episode as relevance realization, as autopoietic, etc. But before we can understand that, what I really found interesting was how he takes down at least 3 or 4 different theories, right? First, that, the whole idea of symbols and representation, that a mind works in like symbols and representation, and that representation of the outside world in our mental model, and how we symbolize the concepts and categories, etc., that represent reality. And somehow relevance realization is by better understanding the concepts, categories, symbols in our head. He says that's not going to work, right? Which is very interesting, because right away he's trying to say it presupposes how we created those concepts, categories, and symbols. Therefore, by just working at that level of abstraction, you're not going to be grounded in what got you to the right representation, the right relevant concepts and categorization. And as I read through this chapter, the entire episode, I've been also reading at the same time The Matter with Things, which is, the McGilchrist work. Yeah. And what's really interesting about this is that literally it maps very well to this left brain, right brain. And when he tears down, Vervaeke tears down the idea that abstract representation is not going to give you relevance realization. It's like saying, if you only live in the world of left hemisphere, where you're dealing with abstractions, you're not going to be sure about why you're dealing with it. And then he goes ahead and then he talks about this whole idea of multiple object tracking, which he says also presupposes, which is saying, can you, if you are given the whole world, which is the ability of the right brain to see the whole world as a gestalt, and then you start seeing things like happening, like objects moving in your space, and you're tagging them, right? So you're not fully understanding them in a symbolic way, but what he calls fasting, or there's an acronym he used, right? Fistening or something. All they're doing is salience tagging, and which to me is right brain activity. And then he says that also presupposes relevance realization. So what's interesting is that it is very consistent with, if we have a left brain conceptual view of relevance realization, it's not going to work. If we have a right brain, I'm going to see all the salient factors of the whole picture of the gestalt. That's not going to work, right? That's not enough. And then he says, okay, what about the computational view, the algorithmic view, right? He said that's not going to work because it's limited to algorithms. And then finally, he says, what if it's a module inside the brain? That's not going to work. So I think what's interesting is that he systematically dismantles what you would conventionally approach as relevance realization as left brain, right brain, or something that can be understood. And he is systematically setting up this fact that relevance realization cannot be explained as a systemic theory, right? And then he says the only way to explain this is to go deeper. And then he introduces the most powerful idea, the last 10 minutes of this episode, of the characteristics, which is you have to be self-organizing and self-surviving and autopoietic. And only then does it matter for you to even have relevance. And he ties it to life. And I think it's a fantastic kind of tour de force of how he's like dismantling the objections and then introducing the key characteristics. That's, to me, what I took away, and I loved it.
Thank you for that summary. That was very well done, Anurag. Very nice.
Yeah. You're passionate about it. I can tell.
And I'm glad you tied it with Miguel, Chris, because I agree that what they're talking about very much synchronizes. And yeah, well, even there was a part of 28 where I realized that there was fast processing, slow processing was brought up too. Oh yeah, heuristic processing versus algorithmic. Well, heuristic is fast and algorithmic is slow. So there's that, and that's left right brain again. So that's interesting too. Yeah.
Cam?
Okay, so I don't think I need to introduce anything new. I think I can play off of what both of you. So I think I'm with Michael. You're just explicit about it because you're a practitioner. Like you're looking for actionable things here. Like you're looking to
Absolutely.
build skills. You're gonna apply and practice. And I'm the same, very much the same way. I don't have the same formal position as you do, but I'm very much doing it on one-on-one basis. I realize practically with everybody I encounter on a daily basis.
That's
And
right.
then I'm actually playing another game here at the way higher level, I think, of the culture. So Anu, you're kind of enamored of the takedown. You said takedown. As someone, as a wrestler, that has a very particular meaning. And I agree, he is. He's taking it apart. And it reminds me of something he says early on in the whole series where I think he says, I want to steal the culture.
Yeah.
So this literally, I really do believe that what he is doing here through this, and we're basically what extensions of whatever he is up to, is it literally is a dismantling of certain cultural presuppositions.
Yep.
And he's doing it in a very careful way. And I take that very seriously because at this phase of life, like I'm thinking about those who will hopefully live on beyond me. And I'm now seeing I hope you'll forgive me the biblical reference, but the sins of the father are visited upon. I think the way that goes is it's not just the next generation, it's like the next seven or something. I don't remember exactly the what the warning is there, but it's real. I see it played out. So as a father, I'm like, oh, huh, okay, well, what is at the end of 30, he gets into, okay, so I lied. I am going to introduce one last thing that's new. So he gets into opponent processing at the end of 30. So as if I'm aware of what it is that I'm doing, I'm realizing that I am a sinner, as in I'm going to miss. I'm going to do things in my life that are going to have consequences after I'm dead and gone that are probably not good for somebody. So what can I put in play to counter that? Is that I can't just let them run, it doesn't seem. Maybe I could, but I'm gonna choose the other game and I'm gonna say, do I know that I'm influencing the culture to some extent every single day. I believe that anyway. So what do I put in play that's countervailing? So then to go back to the things that you guys already said and where I would go with this dialogue is both of you talked about the multiple object tracking. So I would actually play with that in our own experience here. Like, I'd love to hear your own experiences with that, how you heard that, and actually relate your own experiential reality with respect to not theoretical, not hypothetical multi-object tracking, but I'll just give you the example. The one I was listening to that part of the episode is I'm doing like 80 miles an hour down I-90 today on the way to work on a motorcycle. So the multi-object tracking is really, really real for me.
You better make it right.
Yeah,
so
right. There's relevance better be in place there in that case.
Yeah, well, the trade-off relationship between how many things can I track? Because it's a lot. What's the resolution of any of them? How that's a way different thing. So anyway, so that I would spend some time on that. I think it's 8:30 right now, so we got 30 minutes left to work with. So, and as I was listening to you, I knew what I was basically hearing was that the point that he was making in that takedown, the point that he's making, I hear it as existing categories and processes of categorization are non-starters if you're trying to actually realize what is relevant for you.
That's right.
And the you made me think of you, Michael, where it's like the you is actually the client for you. It's like, how, dear client, the only way, like you, I don't have the answers for you. You have to realize what is relevant for you. What I can do is maybe help show you, bring you to that realization of what are the actual processes. And that's the participatory. That's the last part, the last paragraph of the summary that I said. He says, we noted along the way about how this links up with an argument about how the propositional, so which is, as a counselor, all you're doing is proposing ideas, depends upon the procedural, which then depends on the perspectival, which then depends on and is grounded in the participatory. So it's basically guiding you. If you're trying to think your way out of something, you're gonna fail.
It's not going to work.
You actually have to you actually have to move your body in some different manner, and it's going to be unique to you, but it's going to be different than what you've been doing. Okay, so so the two things then are to dwell on the multiple object tracking, and then that second part is, I guess, is developing the technique in guiding attention to that realization that the propositional is dependent upon the procedural.
Yeah. Michael, let's
sure.
build on the topics that Cam has introduced. Your
Well,
thoughts?
I'm gonna kind of launch in by my personal experience of the tracking, and I'm not sure if this is actually relevant. I got to give it a stab because it seems to be. So, the process of reorienting your nervous system from a place of trauma to a place of function. My experience of that is that you can only focus on so much at once. And it literally means that you have to put up with the fact that parts of your life are just fucked up while you try to shore up a pillar that was never in place or got knocked down by something. And I think this is true of life in general, because I had a colleague once that he's a very successful entrepreneur. He retired at 40 because he made enough money, he didn't have to work. And he says, in a business, you can only focus on one project at a time. And he's right. I mean, but I think that's true of the person too, is like, if you're trying to restructure something in yourself, tracking those aspects within that is so engrossing that you can't deal with other things at a high resolution anymore. You track them, but they're low resolution because you can only do that in one spot at a time. And that was kind of what I took from this in a practical sense in my frame of things. And in terms of what you were saying about the kind of the sequence of interrelated necessary things that have to align for things to shift, I absolutely agree. And there's all this evidence in the science that I study that say that if you want to change the way your cognitive orientation is from a place of dysfunction, you have to engage in life in ways you usually don't. So if you're depressed, you need to be social. If you have really severe PTSD, it's actually really good often to do yoga or to do theater, even, where you're actually, interacting very intensely with people, very social. And even for me, like often when I feel stuck, if I go exercise, that really helps, right? So, and when the weekend that we did was super helpful because I was in a stress cycle that I could not break. And after the weekend, I felt a lot better. And like I was like, because it was a change of scene, lots of interaction, lots of physical contact, the rustling, a lot of physicalness, and that was really helpful. So I really saw that, it really shook up the system in a good way for me. It was really good. So that's my takeaway about that framing. How about you, Anurag?
I agree with you, and I'm going to build on the whole multi-salient tagging thing that Cam has brought up. My view is, because I have an inclination for abstraction, that I can easily get lost in the map of concepts and symbols and abstractions, and to a fault, right? So what I really like, refreshing about it is that your categorization has limits. Like, so you can keep thinking through these symbols and, rational, logical connections between them and dependencies, and have a engineering / algorithmic mind to the steps that will create these linkages, what I call hyper rational view of really kind of getting a grip on some situation, which is so abstract, and your view of it so abstract that you're not going to make progress even while you're doing it. And what he's very good at saying is that you have to break that, and you have to just come down 3 levels. And what I find really good about that is that that's why when you talk to somebody who's not into those abstractions, they keep asking, what's an example? What's an example? What's an example? And a real life example brings to life, okay, exactly the incidents and the specifics that are going to either support that categorization, support your point about relevance or not. And that, I think, is taking it down from propositional to, how did you experience it? That's like procedural and perspectival. So I think even in conversations, when we get too hung up on abstractions and theories and policies and recommendations or debates among politics or any subject, just taking it down to what your experience is and other person's experiences already starts taking it down a notch. And then you say, okay, how did you arrive at that perspective? Not intellectually, not through logic or induction. How did you arrive at it viscerally? What happened to you? That, like, what was the experience in your body, in your life, or your participatory or perspectival experience with understanding other people's perspective that got you here? So that I find very refreshing, my way of breaking out. And the other part, which I found, the salience tagging, like, is the opposite of it. That is, if you go to a new place, if you're a tourist in a new country, everything looks like what they call tourist eyes. Everything is salient because it's new to you, a new way of road signs, new language, new architecture, new smell of food. Like, everything is overwhelming. And that's when you, at some level, realize that it can be refreshing, it can be alarming. But I think that's what happens when you are thrown into an environment where you don't have any way of figuring out what's relevant, because everything is hyper salient and popping up everywhere. With all your 5 senses are getting new stimuli that you're not used to. And then I think you have to step back and start making sense of it. Like, that's when the relevance realization comes by not getting too attached to that. And the word I really liked, we didn't talk about enough. He says the here and now is, you have to point to something and say, this, the demonstrative,
Well, I think it's more
reference
than point. I think
really
he
good.
actually
Yeah.
touches it.
Yeah.
Like,
at some point, you have to go down all the way and say,
it's-
this is what I mean.
Right.
This object, this water, this glass, right? And that inactive, he has a term for it, inactive demonstrative reference, right? I thought was pretty interesting, of like, and that's why he calls it, it's like everything has to come, the contact with reality has to come at that point.
Yeah, you have to make a contact with that which that you are referring to rather than staying here, right? And
Yes.
yeah, totally. Wow,
Yes.
nice. Very nice. Yeah.
Any other topic that comes to mind from this chapter, this
Can you talk a little bit, remind me a little bit more on the what was the demonstration? You said it there at the end. It's a fit.
Well, he kept saying this
so
in the lecture, and he says, in other words, you have to be precise about what it is you say you're relating to. I think, is that right?
Yeah.
Is that what you?
So he's basically saying that when you're doing lot of salience tagging, when a lot of stimuli is coming to you, and at that point, because you don't have the ability to categorize things fast enough, all you can do is here, now, here, now, here, now. All you can do is tag things.
There was another phrase, though, that you used that it was like demonstrative.
Inactive. He said, then at some point, when you're saying here and now, and people say, what do you mean? What's important? You have to point to something and say, this particular object, this particular instance, here and now, he calls it demonstrative reference.
That was it.
demonstrative
Yeah,
reference point.
that's a good one.
Right? And that's basically all the way down to touching reality. Here and now, this is the data point, this is the instance, this is the object right in front of us here and now. And he says that precedes the, he says that precedes the linguistic. See, that precedes the linguistic, that precedes the categorization and conceptualization of that thing. That's the bottom of it. That's like, it's like the pop that happens.
Nice. Okay, and then, so it looks like we have about 20 minutes left. I'm thinking that maybe do we want to try to read the summary of 30, or are we gonna go into it instead?
I think that's a good idea.
Because yeah.
What do you think?
I was going to close out by perhaps touching about in this episode at the end. He talks about the characteristics of relevance realization. Now that he has taken down the theories that don't work, he's teeing up the characteristics that he will go into in the next episode. But I think it's worth spending a few minutes on it if you're
okay. Let's do that.
I do too, good. And I do want to dwell just momentarily. That reminded me that he makes the very explicit point that you cannot have a scientific theory of relevance.
That's right. He very clearly says that.
You can attempt a scientific theory of relevance realization, but not of relevance. And I don't really understand that. I couldn't explain that to somebody.
He kicks off episode 30 with that insight.
Yeah, he talks about it at length.
Yeah. And in next episode, in this episode, he closes by saying, here is what are the elements, and you read some of it. He says, goals of relevance realization has to be internal, right? Internal to any external representation. So you can't say the objects themselves have properties that make them relevant, right?
That's
so in reality, you can't say, oh, object A is relevant or object B is relevant. That just doesn't work. And he also says that nor can it be pre-built. It's not an internal module that lights up and says, oh, my module inside my head is saying relevance 1, relevance 2, relevance 3.
It's not a given. It's not a given across the board.
It's not internal, and it's not in the objects that you're perceiving.
Yeah.
So he's setting it up and saying what it is a process of self-preservation by somebody who is capable of autopoiesis, which is self-organization, and the process is, later on he will call it a living system where you have to interact, and it's in the interaction through which relevance comes, and not preconditioned in the brain or pre-existing in the object that you are grasping.
Yeah, that's
he's saying the connectivity is what, and he said it must be scale invariant, which is a technical term, but what he means by that is that the idea at any point, it should be whether you're dealing with an object to drink a glass with, or you are trying to decide whether you should get married to someone or not, whether it's a very abstract level or whether a very small decision, the idea of whole and parts, gestalt and feature, this idea of relevance realization scales, like from the highest decisions to the lowest decision, the machinery is the same, and it's transjective. It's like connecting the reality to the person or the entity, living entity that's trying to make sense of the goal. That's what he means by self-correcting and organizing in nature. That's how he closes out the chapter.
And it's recursive too, is what he said even before. It has a recursive loop to it. And this is funny because Miguel Christ actually talks about this quite a bit in his book. He calls it the encounter. So he explains that any sort of interaction between you and anything, including inanimate objects, it's an encounter between the two of you, not just you observing. And that encounter changes both entities simultaneously because of the encounter itself. And that there's this ever sort of cycle of growth and evolution, even, which he talks about a lot in this, it's a growth cycle that is ever more complex as it goes upward, unless, well, of course, unless, you don't adapt and then you end, but that's the idea of that loop. And I did want to address real quickly, Cam, about the difference between why scientific explanation cannot be
Please.
attached to this. So he explains that scientific method is it's necessary that you find essences in a thing that are true all the time in those things. So if you have gold, he says gold has
Yep.
certain elements and can't be, gold is gold and it's never different. But if you look at something like a triangle, he says a triangle is not, that doesn't fit that category. Or, if you want to be a little less abstract, like what we were talking about, like what is a cup for? Or, oh no, I know what he was using white. He says, if you want to say all white things, well, you can't, there's nothing besides being white. There aren't enough elements to white things that unify them in a sort of a summary of what they are, like you can with gold. And he says relevance is the same way, because relevance shifts depending on multiple factors having to do with that entity that actually is self-organizing and self-interested in survival and thriving. So it changes so much, you can't put it into a scientific theory, nail it down into those essences. It doesn't work like that, right?
Build on what you're saying. Scientific theory would have to make it predictable.
That's right. Yeah,
measurable and predictable. That's the working definition of a scientific theory, that you should be able to instrument it, measure it, and predict it. And he's basically saying, since it's not a property of the objects you're encountering, nor is it a predetermined module that exists in your brain, neither of the two sides are quote unquote measurable or predictable. Therefore, no simple explanation, scientific theory cannot explain the phenomena, because this phenomena presupposes and pre-exists in all living things that encounter the environment.
Yeah, does that make any sense, Cam? Does that land for you?
Well, yeah, it all makes sense. Like I understand it when I hear Vervaeke say it, and I understand what you guys are saying. I believe what I was asking for, and you're providing, is the opportunity to practice with it a little bit, because it's a very
right. That makes
because it's a very I want to invoke the fish and water analogy, where the taking for granted of the categorization is so embedded in my processes of cognition that it's very challenging. It's challenging for me to start to move thought outside of those, to not take them for granted, let alone bring another person along and help them realize that is in fact what you said, easily get lost in. You easily get lost in the systems of abstractions, and I do too, and I think everybody does. So, but making the distinction, you guys said there was a few key words that stood out. One was science, methodologically speaking, requires the ability to measure, which requires the categorization. So if you're requiring categorization, you're already too high up the
predictability, measure and predict.
Yep. You've already started too high in the process. So then he says you can't have a scientific theory of relevance as a phenomena, but you can of relevance realization. Is that right? I believe that's what he's asserting.
So he's trying to say relevance realization is the process.
Yeah,
just like So he's talking about, he gives a very good example.
And I think he's saying that he is proposing a scientific theory of that, isn't he?
No. He's
very
clear.
No.
No, he's saying relevance.
You sure about that, Michael?
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Yes. Say it again.
He's not saying my theory.
Go ahead.
Vervaeke is not saying my theory of relevance realization is scientifically provable and testable. That's not what he's saying.
He's not saying that. Actually,
he's saying I am explaining a phenomena which is a machinery of how we create meaning. And his explanations are plausible and metaphysical to some degree, psychological to some degree, point to various plausibility constructs. Remember, he talks about 5 things that make it plausible, and it has elegance explanation. But he's not saying that to be a scientific construct. Plausibility construct is what sounds reasonable, not necessarily what is measurable and repeatable. So,
Okay,
and
so
he
you,
compares
so
it very clearly.
I'm gonna just lodge it. I'm gonna lodge an objection in the record here, and I'm
Okay.
gonna say I don't remember what you're saying there, and I think you're both wrong, and I'll stand corrected if I'm wrong. I think I thought I was pretty sure that he was saying the point that he was making was that you cannot have a scientific theory of relevance, but you can have a scientific theory of relevance realization as the process.
I think you might be right about that, actually.
So what's the distinction in your mind? Relevance?
I don't know. That's why I was wanting to dwell on it.
So let me, we might be actually saying the same thing, and let me play back one more time.
No. We were definitely not saying the same thing, Anu.
So maybe I stand corrected. He draws a comparison to evolutionary theory.
Yeah, that's right.
And he says evolutionary theory is a theory, scientific theory about how organisms adapt to environment, to natural selection.
Yeah, he gets into the fittedness.
Right? Nobody's disputing that as a theory. He says, however, there is no scientific theory of fitness. Because
that's right.
Because the fitness is so context specific to every situation that you can't a priori say this is theory of fitness, right?
Yeah,
that's a distinction he makes, and I might have made it incorrectly, but that's a similar analogical distinction I'm trying to make. That he's explaining how relevance realization work, and you're right. Maybe the relevance realization process is explainable and therefore amenable to scientific testing. But he's saying this idea of relevance, just like fitness, is not open to scientific explanation.
And
that sounds closer.
Let me elaborate on that too, because what he's explaining, and this is my interpretation from the science I've read, but I think this is what he said, is that when we're talking about fitness, what it requires is an adaptive response to changing environments. So that's why it's not predictable, because you don't know the combination of you as an entity, the environment in a shifting dynamic. You don't know what's going to happen. So you don't know which problem-solving orientation is the best one. And he talks about sympathetic and parasympathetic in that regard at the end, which is exactly what I've studied. Although polyvagal theory adds a third element to that, which we don't probably have time for right now. But my understanding of it, and this is what I work with clients, is that when your mechanism of orientation, this subconscious system, matches your problem-solving platform, and this is the cognitive science I've studied explains that there are built-in response, what do you call it, platforms, like ways of responding that have been built into our nervous system through time because they were the most effective overall. And what you have to do is match the right response to the right situation. Otherwise, you're ineffective and you actually degrade your health or chance of thriving, which is why people that are traumatized have such struggles, because when they're in a situation that would demand standing up and saying no, they cave in or they run away. And so that's a real problem, right? Because if you need to stand up and be assertive and you can't, then that's going to just whack out your life. And there's all kinds of examples of that, including, when it's time to sleep, you can't sleep because you can't relax, so on and so forth. So that's my understanding.
Actually, your objection was correct.
Yeah, it was.
In my first articulation, I incorrectly stated that relevance realization is not amenable to scientific explanation. But when I compare it to his notes and my notes on natural evolution, relevance itself is not amenable to scientific explanation. Relevance realization as a virtual engine or a machinery or a process is like natural selection. So I stand corrected. And we can go back and go back to the source material and see if there is more nuance there.
No, I think Cam, I think you got spot on, is that we confuse those two things in terms of that. Yeah.
I'm glad that we got through that little knothole.
Yeah, damn it.
That so was that a demonstration of this? So I think I'm gonna try to say this in less than 30 seconds, and then I'm gonna be quiet and let you guys have the last word if you'll take it. So what was occurring to me as I was listening to the two of you is the oscillation. So that dynamical system, it seems to me that it has to do with an oscillation between the local individual identity, so this body, this person, and some higher order identity. So the three of us are forming one coherent whole in some sense, is what I'm imagining here. So my sense of identity is oscillating between those two more or less harmoniously, is, I think.
Or is that another?
That practice, the awareness of that, encourages the amplification of the harmony that facilitates the self-correcting, self-organizing identities.
So that's you were saying a higher order. Is that something you read in this material? I'm not so sure I remember that. Oh, well, you're just saying. Oh, okay. I think that's, I mean, I think I agree, but it's and all, in terms of us forming, well, from the polyvagal theory, we don't process or we don't, our nervous systems are not independent. We everything with other people. And so when you're with other people, you're actually sharing cognitive function, which is exactly, I mean, it's amazing how true that is, because you spotted something that we missed, which is a huge benefit to everyone here, right? And in Anurag, even though you say you tend to be stuck in the abstract, but you're really good at that, which actually helps me because I'm not as good as you are. Maybe I'm better at on the embodied part because I do it every day, all the time. And I think that all informs. It's not like one's better than the other. They're all necessary. Just when they're out of balance, it's a problem. That's how I
build on what both of you are saying. As my last remarks is that, to me, what's going on here, three of us, I see it as, we can call it the practice of logos or dialogos, where each of us comes with some understanding, however good, which is limited because we are limited minds and we have our own biases. And this process of ping pong among three of us allows us to expose our own gaps and collectively leave with new shared insights that would not be obvious if we were just continuing to read on our own or talk to ourselves. So in that sense, I think that's what we are practicing here, the logos, in the open-ended sense of the word.
That's cool.
From process point of view, if you don't mind, I'll call the session close. And anything else you want to say as closing acknowledgement ceremony?
Namaste.
Namaste.
It really is, I guess. Yeah, it's just really I go back to gratitude. I'm really valuing the fact that we all have different contributions. And also, I wanted to just voice this. I do believe, though, there has to be a certain level of sameness to be able to do this. Because if we were too different, we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing. And I think that's what, when we met at the workshop, that drew us to the workshop, that our sameness did. And now we're able to do this because of that base. That's my a hit I just had when we were going through this last bit. And I'm like, yeah, I think that's really true. You have to find the sameness to then dialogue to some degree, right? I mean, I'm not sure how much that is, but that's my experience in life so far. So, yeah.
Nice.
Thank you.
Yep.
Namaste.
Namaste.